Tonight, if you've been a part of our Sunday evening seminar before, you know the format, but if you don't, please understand what you're in for tonight is not a sermon. I love sermons, I love preaching, I love the opportunity I get to do that, but tonight will be something a little bit different. I want to begin by telling you a story to help you get into what we're doing here. A couple of years ago, a student came to see me, and it was at the behest of a friend, actually. He had been struggling for some time with concerns about the rationality of Christianity. In fact, it was a source of great frustration and disappointment for him and for his parents, having grown up in this church, having been involved, to come to the place where you say, I just can't rationally believe the things that that this church teaches. It was a difficult thing, and he came and he talked to me about that, and over a couple of months, I got to know him and got to see some insight into his perspective and into where this came from. I want to read a email that he sent me after a bit. He said, Mr. Edgerly, forgive me for not being able to talk to you one more time before I left for college. I emailed you to say thank you. Thank you for giving your ear to me quite a few months ago and recommending the books to help guide me along my way. I was able to dig into a few of the books, and it has helped to dispel much doubt about the rationality of Christianity. It has opened my eyes to an underlying problem within myself that has prevented me from taking that final step to Christ. I hope that one day I may see the world as you do and as others do, but as for now, all I can do is express my gratitude. That, in a nutshell, is what this series is about. It is our conviction that we need to broaden our approach to Christian education in the local church. Churches like ours need to, because studies consistently show and increasingly show that our effectiveness at educating, especially the younger generation, is losing its effectiveness. In other words, greater and greater numbers of people inside the church hold an unbiblical worldview. Greater and greater numbers of people, in fact, are biblically illiterate, unable to articulate the faith that they adhere to, or to recognize false beliefs, false ideologies when they see them, much less give a meaningful response to them. Now, I don't want to paint a skies falling picture, especially in churches like ours, evangelical churches. There is relative strength in terms of what's happening in the American religious landscape. But we are subject to some of these trends. And so let me put it to you like this, that your pastoral staff, after our review of the relevant literature and prayerful consideration of the biblical injunctions for us to teach, after that, we've come to the conviction that we need to broaden our approach to Christian education. Simply put, we, that means us, that means you, we need to read again. We need to learn to think again. We need to learn to articulate our faith again. We need to become, as it were, active learners, not merely passive consumers. I fear that far too often in our own church, we look a lot more passive than active in our education. So what to expect tonight? What to expect from this series? Okay, expect to think. If you came here ready to be challenged, you're in the right place, because we're going to think tonight. Expect to better understand what you believe and why you believe it. Expect to be inspired to love God with your mind, and expect to the fullest extent possible honesty and clarity and charity from me. That's my aim tonight. I want to say a word that I think that we need to stretch here. You're going to stretch. If you stay with me tonight, you're going to be called upon to stretch. And I think we need to stretch. But I want to say a word to perhaps maybe some in the audience who would be like the student that I shared his story earlier, who say, really, the truth is, I'm here and I don't believe a word of what you guys teach every Sunday. Or I'm here and I don't know how to give an answer. Or I'm here and I have great doubts about these things. Here's what I want to say to you. Tonight, I'm going to have to fly at a pretty high level, but I will go down low enough to give enough detail, enough explanation, and enough quotation for you to understand, for you to see why I'm saying the things that I'm saying. Does that sound fair? Does that make sense? Okay, I'm not going to misrepresent people. I've worked very hard, and my belief about the necessity of loving my brother tells me that I don't get to attack straw men here. I have to represent people's views in the best possible light, and that's what I'm aiming to do. It will be impossible for me to be exhaustive tonight. I encourage you as I go through this for you to write down, if you have questions, maybe objections to something that I say, I would love for you to just jot that down in your phone, however you want to do that, and I'd love to visit with you after tonight's over. But that's what to expect here tonight. Naturalism is our topic. Naturalism versus supernaturalism. I'm going to argue tonight that naturalism ought to be rejected. I'm going to argue tonight that despite claims to the contrary, naturalism is not science, nor is it commended by science. I'm going to argue, secondly, that naturalism is not a successful alternative to the Christian worldview. And what we do tonight, by the way, will lay the foundation for much of the rest of the series. So let me tell you a story. That is Zachary Engineering Center, at least as it once was. I think it's under significant renovations now. Any Aggies in the house? Yeah, that was kind of weak. Yeah, thank you. Sounded like a friend of mine when he did his first whoop and it came out like, whoa! It was so embarrassing. The whole restaurant turns, it's like, what just happened? But anyway, no, when I earned a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Texas A&M University, I want to tell you about the first day of physics lab. Physics, first semester of physics, freshman year, you go to the lecture, then you go to the lab, and I'm supposed to be learning about the physics of motion, right? And the first lecture opened something, this was the basic content of the lecture. The Bible's terrible. It's not worth you reading, and if you're going to learn physics, if you're going to create space in your brain for physics, you're going to need to get rid of that Bible. Okay. Now, it was expressed in something of a rant. Sometimes people are better at saying that, but that's not uncommon nowadays. And what I couldn't say then, what I wouldn't have been able to tell you then, but I can tell you confidently now, is I wasn't being taught physics in that classroom. What I was being taught was philosophical naturalism. And so what I want to do tonight is I want to zoom in and I want to give a close look at naturalism. And then I want to contrast that with Christianity, in particular supernaturalism, but we'll talk about Christianity as well. So here's the plan tonight. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to get a thorough overview of what exactly naturalism is, okay? We're going to look at what it is and where do we see its influence in our culture. And then after we've done that, we're going to move on to a response where I'm going to argue that naturalism is not science. I'm going to argue that it's not religiously neutral and that it's not ultimately satisfying intellectually. Okay, so let's go to it. What is naturalism? Here's a definition. Naturalism is the belief that there is no God, call that atheism, and therefore nature is all there is, materialism. Okay? That's what we're talking about. No God, and nature is all there is. That's what I mean tonight when I say naturalism. Okay? Here's an expression, a very famous line, opening book of Cosmos, written by Carl Sagan, that expresses a naturalistic viewpoint. He says, the cosmos, the universe, nature, right? The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. Now, if we zoom in a little bit further, we say, okay, what does that mean? Well, that means, according to naturalism, that everything that exists may be reduced to fundamental forces like gravity or electromagnetism or fundamental particles, like some of these elementary particles that we're studying in the Large Hadron Collider. Here's another expression of naturalism written by late philosopher Bertrand Russell. He, in an essay called A Free Man's Worship, he says, man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end which they were achieving. Let me translate that. Everything that exists, including you, is a product of blind causes. Blind, irrational causes. So man, his origin, his growth, his hopes, his fears, his loves, his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. Blind causes, accidental outcomes. Okay, that's naturalism. Now, let's talk about the main tenets of naturalism. First is atheism. There's no God, and there's no supernatural, nothing like God or anything supernatural. The second tenet follows from that. If there's no God, there's nothing supernatural, then the physical universe is all that exists. Now, if the physical universe is all that exists, then that means there's no God outside monkeying with it. There are no miracles. Does that make sense? If this is the way that the universe is, then absolutely everything in the universe is determined. How is it determined? It's determined by the operation of physical laws that are blind, irrational, and mechanistic. So it's a very deterministic view of the world. In fact, Stephen Hawking, who died recently, celebrated mathematician and physicist, said this. He said, "Free will is an illusion. Everything, including human behavior, your behavior, is determined by the laws of nature." Now, if the universe is like this, then your joys, says Francis Crick. Anybody know who Francis Crick is? Cliff will probably be talking about him. He's famous for the discovery of the molecular structure of DNA. Francis Crick says, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity, the I that you think is an I, your free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. That means your thoughts, your desires, when you say I, your choices, they aren't real. They don't mean anything. They're no more than matter in motion. Meaning, purpose, that's just an illusion created by accidental blind forces. The third tenet of naturalism is relativistic morality. This gives great consternation because we don't like some of the outcomes that come from it. Nevertheless, if the universe is like what I have described to this point, and on the naturalistic view it is, then moral claims are accidental. They're preference. They don't mean anything. They're not fact. So there is no good. There is no evil. There's no right. There's no wrong. There's no objective duty. You can say it should be this way, but when you say that, what you're saying is that's what I would like it to be. It doesn't mean anything. Steve Pinker is a cognitive psychologist at Harvard. He wrote a book called How the Mind Works. In this book, he acknowledges that science shows us that morally responsible human beings do not exist. Why does he say that? He says that because he believes that science shows us a naturalistic view of the world. Morally responsible human beings don't exist. But he says we can ground morality in the idealization that they do. And so what Pinker seems to be saying is that although we're nothing more than biological machines produced by irrational, amoral processes, we can still learn moral truths by imagining what it would be like if we were in fact morally responsible. Now, if that sounds, I'm hearing a few snickers, but that it sounds convoluted because it is. His first statement was true to naturalism. Morally responsible human beings do not exist if the other two tenets of naturalism are true. So that's what we've done so far, is to say, what is it? What are we talking about here? Now I want to ask, where do we see naturalism's influence? And there are a few places that I want to highlight. The first is in Rising Nuns, and that's not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S, Rising Nuns. And what this refers to is studies have shown, and in fact this is spiking in the last decade, that there are an increasing amount of people who no longer affiliate with any religious system, no longer affiliating with any religious systems. And in America, right, that basically means they're leaving Christianity and saying, I don't have religious beliefs, okay? And many of those who abandon religion cite naturalistic belief as the reason that they are abandoning religion. In media, William will give a presentation in a couple of weeks on art, beauty, and excellence. But if you were to pay attention, maybe after you've learned what you learned tonight, if you were to pay attention to the movies and the TV you watch, not to what's said explicitly, but to what the underlying view of reality is, what you would discover is that it's thoroughly suffused with naturalism. Remember, this is what Tim was saying. I can't affiliate any longer with the beliefs that this church espouses, because I've come to a place where I think the naturalistic view of the world is more rational. In the classroom, I read an article in the New York Times where a professor at the University of Washington was talking about his first lecture, first day of class. If you're an undergrad in his biology class, he was describing the lecture, and it was a somewhat braggadocious article, but effectively what he says is, here's what I do. Students come into class, and I tell them that science is demolishing religious belief. And it's fine if you want to hold your religious viewpoints. That's fine for you to do that. But just know that if you want to hold to scientific beliefs, you're going to have to do overwhelming mental gymnastics to retain those religious beliefs. And so the obvious implication is, well, then I ought to just quit doing that, and I ought to give up my religious beliefs, and I ought to take on the scientific belief. In the classroom. Oh, by the way, what do you think happens when you have, if this is the norm, or if this is increasingly becoming normal behavior in our university classrooms, what do you think is going to happen in the high school setting? Where do we get our high school teachers? Right? Out of this system. So if we are taught in the higher educational system that this is the way the world is, what do you think is going to happen in the grade school education system? So we see this ascendant naturalism in classrooms of all levels. In our churches, as many as half of teenage Christians say they don't believe in the central claim of Christianity, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And many of those who abandon Christian belief, they cite naturalistic belief in the name of science as the reason that they can no longer believe. Now, I want to ask the question, why is this attractive? Why is this view? There's no God, physical universe is all there is, morality is relative. Why is that attractive? I'm going to give you a couple of reasons, and I'll walk you through those. The first is this, that naturalism, it underwrites our desire for absolute autonomy. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean this, that if naturalism is true, then I am under obligation to no one but myself. Now, as it turns out, people, myself included, we like the idea that I can do whatever I want when I want. And naturalism underwrites that desire. It underwrites sort of this extreme individualism. It's about me, and I can do what I want. I can create my own meaning and my own purpose and my own sense of what is good and right and true. Now, Romans 1:20, 18 through 28, I've kind of condensed that passage here. But it says this, the Bible says that people generally suppress the truth about God, although they have this knowledge of God. They don't honor God. They exchange this knowledge of God, this reverence that we ought to have for God, exchange that for reverence for man, in particular for oneself. They exchange the truth of God for a lie that God doesn't exist. They don't acknowledge God. So the Bible is pointing to that in every human being, there is this innate knowledge of God. In every person. No matter where you are on this planet, there's an innate knowledge of God. But the Bible also says that there is this innate desire to suppress that knowledge. You see that? Because that's the biblical explanation for naturalism's appeal. And some of you might be thinking, now wait a minute, that guy, he just Jesus juked us. Because he was good to this point, he hadn't started citing Bible. I don't believe the Bible, right? You might be saying. Why should I believe that this is the reason naturalism is appealing? Well, let me ask this question. What do you think a thoughtful, thoroughgoing naturalist might say about the explanation that I just gave you from the Bible? I'm going to give you a couple examples. The first one comes from C.S. Lewis. You're going to say, now wait a minute, that guy's a Christian. Well, he died a Christian. When he was at Oxford, he was not a Christian, he was an atheist. He, as a young man at Oxford studying there, he wrote this later about that period in his life. He said, I had always wanted, above all things, not to be interfered with. You see, naturalism underwrites that desire, not to be interfered with. I had wanted, mad wish, to call my soul my own. He went on in this autobiography to say, you must picture me alone in that room at Magdalen College at Oxford, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. I did not see then what I see now as the most shining and obvious thing, the divine humility, i.e. grace, which will accept a convert even on such terms. Now, you still might be saying, okay, but that's a Christian who's reading back his earlier experience through this Christian viewpoint. And let me give you another one. Thomas Nagel, who is to this day a naturalist, a widely respected philosopher, professor emeritus at NYU, commendably honest about his bias, but he speaks from experience when he says this. I'm going to read you the fuller quote. He says, I want atheism to be true, and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent, well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Now catch this, is insightful. My guess, says Nagel, is that this cosmic authority problem is not a rare condition, and that it is responsible for much of the scientism and reduction of our time. See, what Nagel's saying is exactly what the scripture says in Romans chapter 1. And so to this point, what I want you to see is there's good evidence that at least part of naturalism's appeal has nothing to do with science and has everything to do with our desire for personal autonomy. Now, another reason for naturalism's appeal is the problem of evil. And I can't get into this tonight. In fact, Kevin Goodwin, later in this series, will be dealing with the problem of evil in one of his seminars. And what I'll say about that is a good example comes from C.S. Lewis's own life. When he gave reasons why atheism was attractive to him, he talked about the death of his mother when he was a child. He talked about his experience of the trenches in World War I, and it just seemed that a world broken like this didn't seem to fit with the existence of God. He also mentioned, we'll say, intellectually sloppy Christians. So file that one away. I can't develop that right now, but we don't need any more of that. What I do want to say about the problem of evil is that Lewis found good answers. I can't cover them tonight, but he did find good answers. And again, Kevin will be dealing with this topic a little further later in our series. The third reason for naturalism's appeal is that there's been this conflation of science and naturalism. We've grown up in this age of technological and scientific marvels. Anybody see that picture of the blue dune they got from the Mars rover? The red planet with it's gorgeous, amazing, right? We've grown up in an age where we shoot rockets into space. We land rovers on Mars. We have iPhones, okay? You know, right? I mean, we pull oil out of the ground. We turn it into energy and a whole lot of other neat stuff that makes our lives better. We fight cancer, you know. We eradicate diseases. So we look around and we say, there is powerful, science is powerful. I see power there. I see authority there. And so this narrative, if it is the case that science and Christianity are in conflict, then many people are saying, well, I can see the power and authority of science, so I guess I'm going to let Christianity go. And what I want to say to you is that this idea that Christianity can't be true because science is true is a false choice, and it's where we're going to go next. So we've gotten through the part of our presentation where we understand what is naturalism. Where do we see it in society? Where do we see it in culture? Why is it appealing? Now I want to respond to it, okay? And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to argue first that we're not forced by science into naturalistic belief. I'm going to argue that naturalism is not science, it's not commended by science, and in fact that science is more at home in a theistic view of the world than it is in a naturalistic one. So y'all ready? Okay. Let's come back to this statement that we saw earlier. Carl Sagan, late science writer, very famous astronomer, and this statement, you've probably heard it before. You've probably at least seen the series on TV. But he says, the cosmos, nature, the universe, is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. I want to ask the question, is Carl Sagan making a scientific claim here? Is he thinking scientifically when he says this? It seems to me that if I take Sagan's view for what it is, his statement for what it is, that he's positing, he's suggesting that there's an eternal universe. It's all that ever is or was or ever will be. Now, what's the problem with that? This picture reflects the standard cosmological model called the Big Bang. Okay, and here's the issue with the Big Bang and Carl Sagan's statement. The Big Bang posits a beginning. Now, up here on this little this little picture that you're looking at, it says quantum fluctuations. We're going to touch that a little bit later, but nevertheless, the issue here is that the best scientific data we have says that the universe began. Why is Carl Sagan saying it's all that is or ever was or ever will be? Is that a scientific statement? You see that? Now, if the universe had a beginning, how does Carl Sagan know that it's, quote, all that is or ever was or ever will be? The answer is that he doesn't know that. We could ask then, why did he write it? Why did he write this as though it were the view of science? The answer is that he assumes it to be true. I can't judge the internal motivation. Perhaps he wants it to be true, but I can at least say that he assumes it to be true despite evidence to the contrary. So here's the thing to see. Here's what I want you to get out of this. That naturalism, in particular tenet 2, that the physical universe is all there is, that is being put forward as though it were the finding of science. And it seems that Carl Sagan doesn't recognize that he isn't saying something scientific, but he's saying something philosophical, theological. Let me try it to say this one more way. A great leap is happening. A great leap of faith is happening. I think it's a rash leap. I think it's a foolhardy leap. It's certainly not a scientific leap, but a great leap of faith is happening without its being recognized. Now, as I mentioned, my goal in this presentation is to be fair and to be honest. I don't present this example as the one time you can find a mistake like this. It isn't like that. It isn't like that at all. This is representative. That's the question I want to ask. What's going on here? Why is this widely regarded scientific mind speaking in his own area of expertise saying this? Is this an exception? Let me introduce you to Richard Lewontin, who's a naturalist, a Harvard biologist, a naturalist himself. What he did was he reviewed another of Carl Sagan's books called The Demon-Haunted World. Subtitle, Science as a Candle in the Dark. By the way, if you want a definition of scientism, that's it. Science as the only light we have. We can only know anything because of this particular candle that we have. Everything else is darkness. Okay? Richard Lewontin reviewed his book, and he points out that science, and hear this, students, college students, youth, you need to hear this, okay? That professor is not an objective, unbiased, dispassionate. It's not how it goes. You need to hear this, okay? He points out that science, as it is actually practiced by real flesh and blood human beings, his peers, begins with a prior commitment to naturalism and proceeds with bias. This is his argument. These are his claims. Proceeds with bias against any evidence that does not fit the popular theories of the day. He levels 3 devastating critiques of Sagan's work and then applies it generally to the literature of much of scientific writing. He says first that Sagan makes a case for scientism by proceeding on an thoroughly unscientific argument. In other words, what he says is, if you read this book where Carl Sagan tells you that science is the only way you can know anything, the problem you're going to have is that the case that he makes isn't scientific. It's one big circular argument. You can't get to the conclusion that science is the only way to know anything through science. It's a major logical fallacy, not in one place, but the whole book is built on it, is what Lewontin is saying. Second criticism points out Sagan's confidence in science depends on prior philosophical assumptions, which he doesn't recognize, and which, as Alvin Plantinga puts it, fit more naturally with theism than they do with naturalism. Thirdly, Sagan doesn't recognize when his own beliefs are not scientifically grounded. He says this is characteristic not just of Sagan's work, but of the scientific establishment. Let me just pull a few phrases. Don't try to read this. Let me just pull a few phrases out of this. In this quotation, what Lewontin says is that because we scientists, and he's not speaking universally, but because most of us have this prior commitment to naturalism, we tolerate unsubstantiated just-so stories. We tolerate unsubstantiated just-so stories. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept naturalism, a material explanation of the world. It is what? He goes on down, he says, it's that we're committed to materialism because we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now that's honest. You don't see that enough, but that's honest. He goes on, he says, no serious student of epistemology, that's the study of how we know things. No serious person who knows what he's talking about actually talks about science as though it were an objective, sort of completely dispassionate pursuit. He says, in fact, that we can point to the reality that repeatable observations, which are the gold standard of science, repeatable observations are often decommissioned as facts and ignored because they don't fit into prevailing theories. Lastly, as to assertions without evidence, by the way, look back at me for just a second before you read that. Look back at me. As I've experienced it, most of the time when there's a charge against the irrationality of say, Christian belief, a phrase like this gets used. Well, you guys just believe things that you don't have adequate evidence for. Okay? Let's continue. As to assertions without adequate evidence, the literature of science is filled with them, especially the literature of popular science writing. He goes on, and Lewontin's a biologist, so he talks about people in his field, and he names names. E.O. Wilson, a guy by the name of Thomas, Richard Dawkins, probably the name more you would know if you know any of them. And listen to what he says about their writing. He says, every one of these men have put, quote, unsubstantiated assertions and counterfactual claims. That is, claims that are counter to facts that we know, not on the fringes of their writing, but at the very center of the stories that they sell in the market. Now this ought to be eye-opening. This ought to be eye-opening. It's not just that scientists sometimes ignore evidence, it is that they make thoroughly unscientific claims and pass them off as science. And it's no coincidence that the shoddy work of some of these guys that he's pointing out proceeds on the fact that they're trying to pass off a naturalistic view of the world and call it science. Now, I need a volunteer right now. How about you, Dula? Would you come up here for a second? Let me just show you what I've got here. Oh, this is Winnie the Pooh. It's a shape sorter, actually. And you can see there's a hole here, an oval shape. And so I want you to put that in there for me. Okay, you can't get it in there. Okay, good. No. Don't destroy my illustration. You will never be called up again if you destroy my illustration. Pull my block back out. All right. Could you get it in if you use this? Okay, no, don't destroy our table either. You won't be invited back. But do you think you could get it in with this?
It'd be difficult.
It'd be difficult. Okay. Well, I think if I give it to Nathan, we'll get it in. But yeah, the point so I'm trying to ask the question: what's going on here? Thank you. Y'all give Jonathan Dula a hand. What's going on here? What is happening is that the square peg of naturalism is trying to be fit into the round hole of science. And since it won't fit, we're having to do violence to science to pass it off as though it were. Naturalism is not science. What do Christians really believe? Here's what we believe about science. The sciences reveal God to us through what he has made. That's what we believe. Psalm 19:1 says that the heavens declare the glory of God. Their expanse, man, they reveal his handiwork. Day to day they pour forth speech. Night to night they communicate knowledge. That understanding that we get is amplified through the sciences. This is what Nobel Prize winning physicist Joseph Taylor said. A scientific discovery is also a religious discovery. There is no conflict between science and religion. Our knowledge of God is made larger with every discovery we make about the world. This is what Christians really believe about science. Now, I've established to this point, I think, sufficiently that naturalism is not science. We're going to move on to the idea that naturalism is not religiously neutral. Let's come back to this. If naturalism is not science, what is it? What are we dealing with here? I want to come back to this claim. We'll come back to the one that Sagan expressed at Tenet 2 of naturalism, that the physical universe is all there is. Let's come back to that claim. Physical universe is all there is. What kind of claim is that? If it's not a scientific claim, what kind of claim is it? It's a philosophical claim. It's a theological claim, okay? Now, naturalism provides us a comprehensive view of reality. In effect, it functions like a religion. What I mean by that is that it answers life's biggest questions. Who are we? Why are we here? Why is there something rather than nothing? Is there a God? What is our purpose? What is meaning? Is there good? Is there right? Is there obligation? Naturalism provides answers to all of those questions, as do other philosophical systems, as do other theologies, as do religions. Not only that, but naturalism requires faith. Remember Lewontin, we have a prior commitment. It's not objective. It's not what science told us. We have a prior commitment to naturalism, okay? Led very widely respected philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, to call it a quasi-religion, which is really just to say, hey, look, we could argue about the definition of religion all day long if we want, so I'll call it a quasi-religion. But what he's saying is it's a religion. In the most important ways, it's a religion. Naturalism also is a competing worldview. It's something that is presented as an alternative view of reality to what we hold as Christians, which is super-naturalism. Now I want you to think about this. If this is the case, then there are implications for the public square. There are implications for the classroom. What does no religion in school mean? Well, no Christianity, no Jesus. Does it mean no naturalism? No. When we are told that we must only teach science in our scientific, in our science classrooms, what is really being said is that science education must proceed from a naturalistic view of the world. Naturalism is not religiously neutral. It's a set of beliefs that function upstream of science. It colors, it affects the way that one does science. Lastly, and this is the last part of our presentation, we're going to evaluate is okay. It's not science. It's not neutral. But is it a better view of the world? Is it intellectually satisfying? I want to ask the question: is it reasonable? And please understand, we're going to stay up here, and we're not going to multiply examples because I got about 15 or so minutes left. But I'm going to give you examples that are representative. You understand? Honesty and charity and is what I'm going for as I give you these examples. This is one of many reasonable arguments. You could argue with this one if you want, but this is one of many reasonable arguments for God's existence. It goes something like this. If something, like the universe, begins to exist, then it has a cause. Okay? Pretty much how things work, right? The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. That's the Kalam cosmological argument, by the way. And it's just one of many reasonable arguments for God's existence. Now I want to ask the question, what caused the universe? And I also want to let you ask the question, why does Justin have a cupcake up there on his platform? The reason is because I had another illustration planned. If you were to ask me, Justin, where did that cupcake come from? And I was to tell you, well, the reason there's a cupcake there is because of spontaneous cupcake generation. Okay, yeah, you don't find that intellectually satisfying, do you? Okay. In a relatively recent book, the late Stephen Hawking and a colleague, Leonard Mlodinow, wrote a book called The Grand Design. They said this. They said, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. Why the universe exists, why we exist, it is not necessary to invoke God. Now, one wants to ask, where did gravity come from? You can see there's a problem with the definition of nothing in here, right? But I want to make it even clearer by saying this, that when Hawking and Mlodinow are asked to make their case for naturalism, and they're asked what caused nature, their answer is nature caused nature. Okay, that is circular. That's a logical fallacy. Not only is the central argument of this book logically incoherent, but many of their peers, and again, we're talking about not just Christian people, but naturalist people too, have criticized the alleged scientific basis for this in M theory, calling it, quote, ill-defined, a myth, science in a zone for which we have no evidence. Well, science in a zone for which we have no evidence is not worthy of the name. Here's a very perceptive comment, another review of this book by Tim Radford. M theory, which is the theoretical basis that Hawking and Mlodinow based that statement on. M theory invokes a prime mover, a begetter, a creative force that's everywhere and nowhere. This force cannot be identified by instruments or examined by comprehensible mathematical prediction, and yet it contains all possibilities. It incorporates omnipresence, omniscience, omnipotence, and it's a big mystery. Reminds you of anybody? What caused nature? How do we get from nothing? How do we get from nothing to nature? The only reasonable, the only possible answer is something outside of nature, i.e. something supernatural. You see, what I'm trying to illustrate here is that supernaturalism is more intellectually satisfying than naturalism, because supernaturalism can account for the beginning of the universe, which we can observe. We could ask another question. What is nature like? Well, we look in nature and we find rationality. We find order. In fact, the whole scientific enterprise is based on the fact that there's order, repeatable. Things happen a certain way. There are these physical laws, or we call them laws of nature, right? We see that when we look at reality. We look at the universe. This is how it functions. There's physical law. Here's the problem. Laws tend to come from lawgivers. We look at this, and we don't have time for it tonight, but you could delve into fine-tuning. And the basic issue is this, is that when there are fundamental constants, we observe that the universe, it looks like it's designed, okay? It looks like it's been monkeyed with. It's been engineered, set up to create all this repeatable order, to actually produce life. It looks like it doesn't have to be that way, and yet it is. And so it's overwhelmingly improbable that it should be this way, and yet it is. That's what people mean when they talk about the fine-tuning of the universe. It looks designed. Here's the thing. Engineers are usually required for engineering. Lastly, we look in the universe, it contains information. Cliff will talk about this next week in his treatment of Darwinism. In DNA, we find information, like computer code level information. Unbelievable. We find sentient creatures like ourselves. And we say information, everywhere else we look in the universe, we see information. It comes from intelligence. It comes from mind. So the best data that we have, says Nobel laureate Arno Penzias, the best data we have are exactly what I would have predicted had I had nothing to go on but the first 5 books, or the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. We concur. What do Christians really believe? We believe in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. We believe that all things came into being through him, and that apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. Come back to this last. Let me back up. I really shouldn't leave this. If you ask me about the cupcake and I start telling you about subatomic particles and quantum probabilities that make up this cupcake, I can't. I mean, not me. Somebody much smarter than me, but can give you a scientific description of what's happening with this cupcake. But if you want a full explanation of the cupcake, you're going to talk to Gigi. In other words, there's a category mistake happening here when we say, because I can describe ovens and temperatures and pressures and particles of matter and how they come together to form that delicious substance. I haven't given a full explanation of what happened there. I haven't said anything about the person who decided to make a cupcake. You see that? Okay. We believe that there is testimony in the heavens that's amplified by science. We also believe there's testimony in the Scripture from the one who was there in the beginning. By the way, Kevin Goodwin's going to have that topic later in the series as well, why the Bible's reliable and so on. So we'll get to come back to that. The last bit of what we're doing is we're saying, is this naturalistic view of the world satisfying? Is that intellectually, is it rational? Should I believe this? Is this reasonable to believe? And again, we find it struggling when we look at morality. Here's Jerry Coyne, biologist at the University of Chicago. He says, although evolution operates in a purposeless, materialistic way, that is what? That's naturalism, right? That doesn't mean that our lives have no purpose. Whether through religious or secular thought, we make our own purposes, meaning, and morality. So here's what being said. The only hope for meaning, for purpose, and for morality is to make it up for ourselves. But if that's the case, then who is to say that Hitler's meaning, purpose, and morality is not to be preferred over, say, your meaning, purpose, and morality? See, what I'm trying to illustrate is that naturalism struggles to account for what we really think is an objective difference between, say, loving and nurturing a child and torturing a child. Naturalism cannot underwrite that difference. Christianity can. This is what prompted C.S. Lewis to say, when we teach our kids naturalism, I'm paraphrasing that part. I'm giving you the context. When we teach our kids naturalism, we make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. This is why our society is chaotic morally. Naturalism is underwriting that chaos. What do Christians really believe? We believe that we are to be holy as God is holy. In other words, we believe that there is an objective right and wrong. There is good, there is evil. There is a real difference between the desires of, say, Ted Bundy and the desires of Jesus. Conclusions. Naturalism is not the message of science. It's not a successful alternative to the Christian worldview. And I have 2 slides left where I want to ask how we should respond to this. It's impressive. 5 minutes left. All right. You may not be impressed. I'm impressed right now. If you knew what it took to get to that point, you'd be impressed. How should I respond? Christian, I want to talk to you first. Christian, I hope in some sense you've been inspired, that you've seen the need to love God with your mind perhaps more robustly than you have in a long time. William Lane Craig wrote, and I think this is right on, he says, American churches are filled with Christians who are idling in intellectual neutral. As Christians, their minds are going to waste. One result of this is an immature, superficial faith. I think he's right. I think we need to stretch. I think we need to broaden our approach to Christian education individually and corporately, in our homes, in how we gather together, and so on. Brothers and sisters, we need to read, and we need to think, and we need to live consistently. Now, I want to say one last word for those who are in here, perhaps are far from God. Maybe you came in, you don't believe, and you know, for whatever reason, you got duped into coming here to listen to this guy talk about naturalism and supernaturalism. If you're far from God, here's what the scripture says. He who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. If you came saying, I don't believe in God, or I don't know if there's a God, or I don't know about all this, I want you to hear from the mouth of Jesus, come to me and learn from me. Come to me and learn from me. Jesus says, if you come, I will give you abundant life. I will give you everlasting life. If you come to me and you keep my commands, you sincerely seek me, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. This is true. I'm living in this experience. And that's the last and the final ground of any kind of evidence for God, the personal experience of him. You have to come to him. You have to come to him. And he said, whoever comes to me, I will not refuse. Y'all pray with me. Father, thank you for this evening and the privilege of getting to do what we've done here. I do pray that you would use it in some way that's needed in the minds and the hearts and the lives of the people that are here with me. Thank you so much for the privilege of doing this in this place, for what I think you're doing in our church to help us to broaden our approach to Christian education, to turn the corner, to course correct. Let it continue. Let it continue, Father, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, that's the end of the presentation tonight. I'm so glad that you came. I'll say a couple of things for you before you go. We'll have Cliff Osmond. Are you up next? You're up next, right? No, Kevin. Sorry, Kevin's up next. Kevin's up next. He'll be here next week. It's going to be awesome. You should invite friends. In a minute, I'm going to say you're dismissed, and so that we all know we're not awkward. I'm going to say you're dismissed. If you had questions that you wanted to ask one of us, we'd love to entertain those. More importantly, if you want to know more about Jesus, there will be Pastor and I and others will be right here. We'd love to visit with you. If you're interested in books, I printed out quite a few bibliographies, 30 some odd books that sort of went into what's here, and I can give you that and point you in the right direction as well. So thank you for being here. You're dismissed.